The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable. As a Lever Premium subscriber, you'll get to hear exclusive bonus content from this episode and others in your feed. To become a subscriber, go to levernews.com.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. After months of staunch support for Israel's brutal war in Gaza, President Joe Biden finally seemed to draw a red line. With Israel already having killed thousands of Palestinians, the Netanyahu government announced its intention to invade the Gazan city of Rafah. But Biden this week said he would not supply the Israeli military with weapons that could be used in an assault on the city where a majority of Palestinian refugees have fled to. It was a big shift for Biden, who's considered himself one of Israel's strongest allies in the U.S. government for decades. As the Lever previously reported, the president has for months ignored his own administration's stated official policy of denying weapons shipments to countries likely to use the arms to attack civilian targets. But this week, with the prospect of an Israeli ground invasion, Biden seemed to change course, under intensifying pressure from growing protests across America. However, Biden's pivot may not deter Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been defiant and insisted that he'll continue the war until Hamas's leadership is eradicated. But that would require continuing the war. And according to recent reporting, Netanyahu refused to accept a ceasefire deal that would return the hostages that Hamas took on October 7th. Today on Lever Time, we're going to go to senior podcast producer Arjun Singh to get a sense of why the U.S. is so intertwined with Israel's war and what's motivating the Biden administration to take the actions they have. Arjun also takes a look at the prospect of a wider regional conflict, one that could pit Israel against Iran. And Arjun looks at how the war in Gaza has been seen from the perspective of Israelis and Palestinians there on the ground.
Last week, I was sitting in the offices of the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C.
Cool. Could I just do a quick sound check?
Sure.
Have you introduce yourself?
Yes, Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute.
I was there to talk to Trita about the relationship between Israel and Iran.
I don't think Iran poses an existential threat to Israel, and even though that is something that is so widely accepted here in Washington, and in fact, mainstream media, oftentimes, New York Times in particular, oftentimes when they say Iran, they say comma, which poses an existential threat to Israel as if it is a clear fact, or at least saying which Israel views as an existential threat, which is also not entirely true.
The reason I wanted to sit down with Trita is because about a month ago, the Israeli government launched a strike on the Iranian embassy in Syria.
Iran is pledging revenge tonight, accusing Israel of attacking its embassy complex in Syria and reportedly killing at least 7 Iranian military officials. That includes a top general.
And then the Iranian government launched more than 300 missiles and drones at Israel in retaliation.
We have confirmation from the Israeli military that those drones have been launched. We understand that they are currently in Iraqi airspace, but we also understand that these drones could likely take up to 9 hours to even get anywhere near Israel. 9 hours, that's a very long time.
9 hours was enough time for Israel, with help from the United States, to shoot down a majority of them. But one did kill a 7-year-old girl. If you just happened to be turning on the news at that time or getting an alert on your phone, this looked like pretty intense stuff. It looked like the Middle East might have been on the verge of a war between the two regional powers of Israel and Iran. But Trita didn't think so.
No, I think it's been very, very clear that if they wanted to have an escalation, they have had 7 months of ample opportunities to do so. And that is clearly not what they're seeking to do for quite rational reasons. This would not be a popular war inside of Iran, nor would it be one that Iran necessarily would be able to do particularly well with, compared to what they think their position will be in a couple of years' time, in the sense that they do believe the time is on their side.
To Trita, the drone attack, though dramatic, could have been far deadlier, and Iran's intentions may not have been to escalate the conflict, but send a firm message to Israel. In other words, having most of the missiles and drones intercepted might have been the point. And Sirota felt that was underscored in mid-April when both governments played down tensions between the two in the wake of an Israeli drone strike on an Iranian airbase.
This regime has been in power for 44 years now, 45. They've had plenty of opportunities to commit suicide. They have rejected every opportunity to do so. They are in a more powerful position, arguably, than they have been for the latter part of those 45 years. That's not a track record of any rational actor. It's a track record of a very cunning, ruthless regime, but it's not suicidal, nor is it irrational.
Iran and Israel have been engaged in shadow fights with each other for a long time, but that conflict usually takes place in the form of proxy battles between armed groups the two nations fund and covert operations. Right now, it looks like a direct conflict may not escalate. But what might have a greater influence on the potential for more conflict involving Israel is what happens right here in the U.S.
Did you see the protest in the back?
That's the GW protest, right? That's where I'm going next, actually.
Yeah, you should go.
As Sirota and I were speaking, right outside of the Quincy Institute's office was an encampment of pro-Palestine protesters who were occupying part of George Washington University's campus. That's partially what made me want to sit down with Sirota last week. Even though the war in Gaza may not be top of mind for every American, in fact, it may not be for a majority of them, the nature and scope of Israel's war in Gaza has imprinted itself on the American psyche. For college students, protests on campus have become a daily facet of life for the past couple months, and coverage of the war has been all over the news and social media. For example, on Wednesday night, Joe Biden sat down for an interview with CNN, something he rarely does. And both the college protests and his recent decision to pause weapons shipments to Israel came up.
If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem.
I want to be very clear about something. The war in Gaza is about much more than the United States. But for a long time, American presidents have intervened in the Middle East to promote American interests. That happened when President Dwight Eisenhower authorized the CIA to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran in the 1950s. And that helped usher in a dictatorship that lasted until 1979. In my lifetime, the US launched 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, conflicts that led to US troops fighting in the Middle East for more than a decade. And there are still troops deployed all over the Middle East. When it comes to Israel, the US and Israel have historically had a very close relationship. It's a relationship Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who spent part of his childhood and teenage years living just outside of Philadelphia, usually highlights when he comes to the United States.
Because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands that cherish freedom and offer hope.
It's also a relationship that's played a large role in President Biden's time as a politician. Starting back in the 1970s, when Biden was a young senator, he met with Israel's prime minister at the time, Golda Meir. And Biden would continue to be a strong backer of Israel throughout his time in the Senate and then eventually as vice president.
It's only natural for 2 democracies like ours. As Ron said, we're like family. We have a lot to say to one another. Sometimes we drive each other crazy, but we love each other. And we protect each other.
As president, Biden has doubled down on that commitment to protecting Israel. Here he is on Tuesday.
And my commitment to the safety of the Jewish people, the security of Israel, and its right to exist as an independent Jewish state is ironclad, even when we disagree.
That's why, to understand what's happening in Israel and Gaza, it's impossible to disentangle the role of the United States from it all. Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of American aid. On average, the U.S. sends Israel around $3 billion a year. And supporters of Israel have a very powerful lobby within the United States made up of various organizations such as AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, who spend money in American elections up and down the ballot to elect politicians who they see as more favorable to Israel. So to better understand the role that the United States is playing in the current conflict, I sat down with Akbar Shahid Ahmed. Akbar is the senior diplomatic correspondent for the Huffington Post and has a deep level of knowledge of how the Biden administration has approached the war in Gaza since October.
We're in a world where 35,000 Palestinians, at a minimum, are dead in Gaza. Most houses are gone. Infrastructure is gone. We will all be dealing with the consequences of this war for not just months, but years and maybe decades to come. So the U.S. already knows it's incurred a huge strategic, national security, humanitarian, and moral cost for supporting the war. Their hope is they can get a win out of this. And interestingly, they're seeking quite an ambitious win out of this.
Most recently, President Biden seemed to draw a red line over Israel going to the Gazan city of Rafah. Rafah has become a refuge for Gazans who are fleeing the violence in the rest of the Gaza Strip. It's also where a majority of the humanitarian aid for Gazans goes through. With the news of a potential Israeli operation into the city, more than 100,000 Gazans, some of whom have already been displaced, have fled again. But it's unclear where in Gaza is now safe. That all being said, according to Akbar, the administration believes they'll somehow be able to craft a long-lasting peace deal out of all of this.
There's a lot of wishful thinking going on right now in the White House and the State Department, I'd argue. Many of my sources have talked to me about how they see top levels of the administration being unrealistic with what they're talking about. And the super deal I'm referring to is a deal that covers not just the end of fighting in Gaza, but also reshapes the Middle East in a significant way by creating a new agreement between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the US, and some version of the Palestinians. They see that as a legacy issue for President Biden. They see it as something that could help them electorally. And it's important to remember they've been driven throughout this war since October 7th by a fear of being seen as not pro-Israel enough. So they see achieving an Israel-Saudi deal with some concessions to the Palestinians as a way to say, look, we have not only dealt with this war, brought home hostages, but also we've delivered new peace for Israel with a major Arab country and arguably the most influential Muslim majority country.
From what's been reported so far, that deal would involve the U.S. signing a security agreement with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for normalizing relations with Israel, the administration would provide civilian nuclear technology and artificial intelligence knowledge with the Gulf nation. What's interesting about all of this is that it's being largely steered by three men who State Department officials have said are ignoring the advice of career diplomats.
There's a real sense in the administration that I've heard consistently from the start of this war hasn't shifted, which is that a tiny, tiny group of people, and specifically a tiny group of men, you're close to the president, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Brett McGurk, who's the president's top Middle East advisor, and the president himself are driving this policy. And the fear among government officials is that their warnings are not heeded, that their policy advice and recommendations are being rendered irrelevant.
Let's start with Tony Blinken. Blinken's the Secretary of State and a longtime advisor to Joe Biden, way back in the days when Biden was a senator.
We've said clearly and for some time now on Rafah that in the absence of a plan to ensure that civilians will not be harmed, we can't support a major military operation.
He's the person who's taking the flak for the Biden administration, right? He's the one who hears from foreign leaders, foreign officials. You're not just dooming us to mass death in Gaza, you are dooming the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East for years to come, right? You've turned so many people against you. Blinken, as a foreign policy professional with many years' experience, understands that, right? So he's in this place where his own agency is in what one State Department official described to me as in a mutiny, right? He's dealing with that. He's dealing with foreign leaders who don't trust him. And he's the emissary for Biden going around the Middle East, sort of constantly being kicked in the face by Netanyahu and other leaders in the region because he doesn't have a new policy to offer.
And there's Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who Akbar told me is still important, but not quite as influential as the other two.
I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, but I will state here what I stated the last time I stood at this podium, which is that the United States does not believe that a massive ground invasion of Rafah, where 1.3 or more million people are sheltering, having been pushed out of other parts of Gaza that are now destroyed, into the area where humanitarian assistance comes in. This is not the best way forward.
Then there's this guy, Brett McGurk.
Before major war and peace decisions are made, the president speaking from his own experience, it requires deliberation. It requires asking hard questions. And it requires making sure that you have a plan in place with achievable objectives, and that plan is actually leading to achieving those objectives. Those are the types of questions I know the Israelis are asking themselves, and we are providing whatever advice we can.
So McGurk is a long-standing fixture of the DC foreign policy establishment going back to the Bush administration when he first launched his career in global affairs without speaking Arabic or working on the Middle East previously as trying to help set up the future state of Iraq after the 2003 invasion. Since then, he's been entrusted with a number of policies by both Republican and Democratic presidents and made a lot of enemies along the way, but also continued to get promoted. I would argue in that 20-year span during which his influence over Middle East policy has grown greater, America does not seem to have crafted a more either humane or clearly beneficial policy in the region.
And as far back as January, according to Akbar's reporting, McGurk was pushing for a Saudi normalization deal.
To the extent we're talking about the sidelining of foreign policy expertise, that's very much a product of McGurk's centralizing power and decision-making on the Middle East in this moment for the administration because he's so connected now and personally quite close to the president. Right, so that's why you've seen his own fixations like the US-Saudi-Israel deal become really the top priority of the administration, which they were not when President Biden took office and certainly was not what President Biden campaigned for. McGurk, I think, sees that as not just Biden's legacy, but his own legacy. And that's what's so critical here is how much is the policy being driven by a personal sense of importance and mission and ego rather than a policy analysis of what it means. These three decisive, powerful men who are guiding Middle East policy under the president not only were never elected to a position in their lives, not in this administration or before, but critically have always been staffers.
Those men might be guiding the effort, but it should be noted that Joe Biden is ultimately the one in charge. As his predecessor George W. Bush once said, Biden as president is the decider. And one area that Biden has been especially hit with criticism over is whether he, as the leader of this administration, believes Israel has violated international law and possibly committed war crimes. Those are heavy accusations. So I asked Akbar how the administration has grappled with them.
Back in February, I broke a story saying that actually U.S. government officials were investigating Israeli war crimes, right? And that was something that was important because government spokespeople, administration spokespeople like John Kirby had been saying for months at that point, no, we believe Israel is following international law.
We have seen them take actions, sometimes actions that even I'm not sure our own military would take. In terms of informing civilian populations ahead of operations, where to go, where not to go.
Internally, yes, it's indisputable. My reporting has shown, and I've heard since February that those war crimes investigations are continuing because they have to, right? I mean, lawyers at the State Department, at the Pentagon, people in the intelligence community know that they are still bound by U.S. law and they are still bound by international law. And regardless of the political decisions at the White House level, on a working level, that's a huge concern. In terms of appreciation of the civilian toll, I think there's definitely been an uptick, and you hear that even at high levels and from people who initially were willing to kind of deny that Israel was disproportionately hurting civilians. The question now becomes, does knowledge lead to action, right? So I think the awareness is there. I think the president does raise these matters with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it's always tempered, right? And I think most notably you saw that after the World Central Kitchen killing. So when an Israeli airstrike killed 7 aid workers, 6 of them foreigners, 1 of them American, President Biden and administration officials were beating their breasts saying, we're going to have an unprecedented phone call with Netanyahu. We're going to tell him this needs to stop. And what you later found out about that call, what I heard from officials, what news reports told us, is that yes, Biden did talk about aid workers, civilian death toll. He also talked a lot about Israel's security concerns around Iran, right, which were escalating at that point. So there's so many other ways in which they are seeing the U.S.-Israel relationship as driven by concerns that are not humanitarian or civilian-focused.
This week, the Biden administration was supposed to deliver a report to Congress about whether they believe Israel violated international law. That report was delayed. Its findings could have massive implications, not just for American policy toward Israel, but also the Biden administration's role in supporting Netanyahu's government since October. Meanwhile, Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, have raised alarms to Biden that they're worried the International Criminal Court, an intergovernmental body that charges and prosecutes, among other things, war crimes, could soon charge Netanyahu. But so far in this episode, I've been talking about things happening outside of Israel and Gaza, which is why after the break, we're going to sit down with a Jerusalem-based correspondent to hear what things are like on the ground there.
So one thing that's important to know is Gaza is separated from the rest of the occupied territories, and it's very difficult for Gazans to leave. They have to go through a really arduous process to apply for permits to exit, which are rarely granted. This includes just for medical care that you can't get in Gaza. So the main feeling of Gazans prior to October 7th for the last decades has been of feeling trapped.
Nathan Thrall is a journalist based in Jerusalem and the recent winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy.
In a way, when I would visit Gaza, and I go to Gaza frequently, it felt almost like time travel, like I was going back in time to an earlier era in the Palestinian national movement. The attitudes of people were really different, and there was a spirit of optimism and of a willingness to fight and a belief in their ability to endure and to prevail. Part of, I think, that belief and the discrepancy in that belief in Gaza and the West Bank is that Gazans were not exposed to Israel, and so Israel for a younger generation was something in the imagination, and I would be in these conversations in Gaza, and then I'd go through the Erez crossing and re-enter Israel and see the skyscrapers and the development and Israel's takeover of land in the West Bank and its steady absorption of the West Bank and the settlements in the West Bank. And it was so far removed from what Gazans believed was on the other side of that wall. So Gaza was a very isolated place.
Nathan spent a lot of time reporting out of both the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These are the two areas that encompass what is in theory supposed to be autonomous territory for Palestinians. The two are separated from each other, though, and they have different governments. In Gaza, the ostensible government is run by Hamas, while the West Bank is currently occupied by the Israeli government. Some supporters of Israel have argued that Israel's military actions are justified because most civilians in Gaza support Hamas, and that it was the civilians who elected Hamas in the first place. But that claim should really be examined in the context that the last time there was an election in Gaza was 2006, 18 years ago. So I asked Nathan what he understood of support for Hamas from his reporting.
There are two answers to this. On one hand, Palestinians are a people, and they consider themselves a single people, including Palestinians in refugee camps in the diaspora, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians inside Israel with Israeli citizenship, and Palestinians in the West Bank. They're all part of the same people, and they feel themselves to be part of the same people. That said, there are, of course, divisions among Palestinians that in some cases are geographical, and part of what Israel has done is to fragment the Palestinian population and to try and ensure that Palestinian nationalism is weakened through fragmentation. And that is a big part of why Israel has made it impossible for Gazans to leave and to come to the West Bank. As far as the international law is concerned, the occupied territory is one territory. It is not a set of territories, plural. It's East Jerusalem and the West Bank. East Jerusalem's part of the West Bank, and Gaza, and occupied people have a right to travel within the occupied territory, which Israel is denying them. It's denying them access to East Jerusalem. It's denying them access to Gaza. It's denying Gazans access to the West Bank. And so if you dig down in any society, of course, you will find those divisions and resentments. And certainly Gazans I know over the years have told me how they don't understand how they keep paying the heaviest price for fighting back against Israel's system of control. And, there were these terrible slaughters that people in the West Bank are witnessing, and they don't understand how people in the West Bank aren't doing more. I think the divisions are very real, but at the end of the day, they are one people with a single national movement.
On the other side of this, however, is the Israeli government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In the face of protests within Israel and even a change of policy from staunch allies like Biden, Netanyahu has said he's committed to continuing the war.
I say to the leaders of the world, no amount of pressure, no decision by any international forum will stop Israel from defending itself. As the Prime Minister of Israel, the one and only Jewish state, I pledge here today from Jerusalem on this Holocaust Remembrance Day, if Israel is forced to stand alone, Israel will stand alone. But we know we are not alone, because countless decent people around the world support our just cause. And I say to you, we will defeat our genocidal enemies. Never again is now.
As the Prime Minister, Netanyahu is the face of Israel's actions right now, and he's ultimately the one making these decisions. But even amongst Israeli moderates, Netanyahu's perspective on denying Palestinian sovereignty may not be too out of touch with his peers.
I think if Netanyahu were to disappear, you would find remarkable similarity in the overall policy toward the Palestinians from the centrist candidates like Gantz, who wished to replace him. And we saw this, by the way. We had a test run when there was a government of Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett a few years ago, and its policy toward the Palestinians was really no different and in some ways worse than Netanyahu's. So there is a consensus in Israel in the center-right, center-left. We can't give them real sovereignty. We can't give them citizenship. We have no choice but some version of this control, and basically the center-left is better able to market that to the rest of the world. It's better able to say that we want it to eventually turn into two states, etc., whereas the right is just much more blunt about saying, no, there's nothing wrong with permanent, limited autonomy under Israeli control.
So where does that leave the Israeli public? Earlier this week, thousands of Israelis gathered in Tel Aviv to protest the Netanyahu government. They called for a ceasefire and an acceptance of a deal that Hamas reportedly accepted that would bring back the remaining hostages in Hamas's captivity. It's a powerful demonstration, but is that indicative of how the Israeli public feels?
I mean, Israelis have been tuning out the occupation that they're administering, the control of millions of Palestinians without basic civil rights for decades. And Israelis have grown very adept at tuning that out and telling themselves that's not really happening here, that's over there. It's almost as though, it's, the U.S. occupation of Iraq. It's some distant thing, and it doesn't have to do with, life in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which is obviously not the case. It's 1 in 10 Israeli Jews are living in the occupied territories. It's not as though they don't have the ability to see it. It's just a couple kilometers away, but there is a great ability to tune it out.
It's very unlikely that this decades-long conflict will end with this war, and it's also unclear how much more the international community will tolerate. Netanyahu has said that he plans to continue the war until Hamas's leadership is eradicated, a goal which is tenuous and will surely result in the loss of more civilian life. Ultimately, some sort of reconciliation process will need to take place, one that fairly accounts for the emotions and traumas that Israelis and Palestinians have both experienced. The question is, what would that reconciliation look like? And are Israelis and Palestinians ready to begin having that process?
That's a very good question. And I think that up until now, the paradigm has been separation. We're just going to partition. That's been the mainstream idea for the PLO and for Israel. We're going to partition the territory. There's going to be a wall. They're going to be there. We're going to be here. And we don't need to deal with reconciling and dealing with history. And that's been part of why all of these past peace processes have failed, because they haven't addressed the history. And for Palestinians, for this conflict to really end, Israelis are going to have to address the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And there's going to have to be a discussion about the injustice for Palestinians of creating a Jewish state in a majority non-Jewish territory against the will of the local population. This is going back even prior to 1948. That kind of conversation, for the most part, by the kind of peace process professionals has been avoided. This is going to lead nowhere. We just have to accept there are two irreconcilable narratives, and we can't resolve that issue. And I think that's been a tremendous mistake. And only now, out of real despair, do you have people who think, there's actually no chance for any kind of peace in the foreseeable future, that I hear some people who are former peace processors say, we need to look at truth and reconciliation. We need to look at how this happened in other places. And I think that it's very hard for me to imagine that there is any kind of sustainable peace that doesn't address the history.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, and edited by David Sirota, Lucy Dean Stockton, and Joel Warner. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with more episodes of Lever Time.